Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined for a third time by Dr. Edward Watts. He is the Vassiliadis Professor of Byzantine Greek History at the University of California, San Diego. In our two previous conversations, we talked about two of his books, namely Mortal Republic and The Eternal Decline and Fall of Rome. And today we're talking about another one of his books, Hypatia, The Life and Legend of an Ancient Philosopher. So, Dr. Watts, welcome back to the show. It's always a pleasure to everyone.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be back.
So perhaps to contextualize things a little bit here for people who might not be familiar with Hypatia and where she lived in, where she came from. So could you tell us a little bit about the social, political, and historical context where Hypatia lived back in Alexandria?
Sure. So Hypatia is born around 355 AD, and this is a moment in the Roman Empire where there's a really significant transition going on. The Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity in 313 AD, and initiated this process through which the Roman Empire was shifting towards a Christian majority state. So when Constantine converted, the empire was about 10% Christian. Constantine died in 337. It seems like the empire tipped to be more than 50% Christian, maybe around the year 400. So during Hypatia's lifetime, you have this process unfolding in Rome or in the larger empire, where you're going from a very large majority pagan empire to a majority Christian empire. And this happens during her lifetime. But what's interesting in 355 is Hypatia is born in the city of Alexandria in Egypt. And Alexandria has probably the largest Christian community in, maybe the world, for any city at that moment when she's born. It hadn't yet become a majority Christian city. And so the pagans in that city are imagining that, Christianity is a sort of nuisance and it's like large and they're loud, but they don't really matter. And it becomes very clear that Alexandria has probably tipped to a Christian majority city when Hypatia is a child. And so she belongs to a generation that actually is the first urban generation to deal with living in a Christian majority city. And so that's it's a really crucial element of her background, right? Because nobody knows how to do this. I mean, Christians don't know how to live as a majority in a major city, and pagans don't know what to do with with a major city in which they're no longer in the majority. And this is where she's growing up. She's growing up as a pagan in this city that, like, during her childhood flipped from majority pagan to majority Christian.
And she remained a pagan throughout her life, or did she change religion?
So Hypatia remains a pagan for her entire life. And I think what's important for us and challenging for us to understand is that paganism in the 4th century isn't a religion of identity like we think of religions now, right? Nobody walked around and said, I'm a pagan, because paganism is, in essence, a default religion. It's a default religious category. So everybody who's not a Christian or a Jew is a pagan. And so there's lots and lots and lots of different beliefs and practices that constitute paganism in the 4th century. So for Hypatia, paganism is about practice. It's about what do you do? And it's about what ways do you live your life so that you're being consistent with what you think the gods want and what you believe is going to lead to, a better outcome spiritually for you and the people around you. And so Hypatia very much is committed to this idea. But paganism for her is a belief system and a set of practices that ultimately helps construct the world in a better way. And so she's very firmly committed to this. And she's very firmly committed to this as a set of ideas and actions, but it's not for her an identity. It's really instead something that's part of a larger embrace of a fashion of living in the world around her. And so there's no way that she would ever imagine that this is something that she should turn away from.
But then you mentioned there that the city became a Christian majority city, and I would like to understand. I mean, if you know about that specifically, in what ways did the social dynamics change when it became a Christian majority city, and were the pagans treated differently by the Christians when they became the majority or not? I mean, basically, I'm trying to understand if her being a pagan or remaining a pagan really had much influence in her than living in a Christian majority city in terms of how she was treated and so on.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that is a challenge for everybody in the fourth century is what does it mean to live in a city where there's a Christian majority? So
Mhm.
Alexandria is a very dense city. You know,
Yeah.
it has probably 500,000 people. It's a very small space. It's more or less an island. And so it is a very difficult place for people to get along without violence erupting. And
Yeah.
Alexandria had a history of violence. And what tended to happen in these violent confrontations is groups would basically jostle for dominance in the city. So if you're the biggest group, you expect that when things resort to violence, you're going to win. And you're going to be able to exert your vision of what the city should be like in a fashion that the other side might not like. And what ends up happening in the middle part of the 350s is there is a violent confrontation that pagans expect they're going to win and they lose. And it becomes clear to them, and this is how we can see that it's probably Christian majority. You know, they thought they had a majority of people and they didn't. And so what unfolds across the rest of the fourth century and into the fifth century are these periodic outbursts of violence where now pagans are fighting as the minority and Christians are fighting from a position of majority. And the Christian majority is growing much more significantly over time. And so by the time violent outbreaks are happening in the 380s, there's no doubt in anybody's mind that you know, there's a Christian majority. And by the time of Hypatia's death in 415, it's a very large Christian majority. And so I think the dynamic in Alexandria that we have to understand is it's a city in which communal differences are resolved violently when they can't be resolved peacefully anymore. And frequently, the leaders of those communities try to diffuse situations so that they don't become violent. But they also are fully aware that they can become violent, and they are prepared when they become violent to be able to win when the violence erupts. And so this is a climate in which Hypatia is growing up. The rules in Alexandria have been very clear for a very long time that if you cannot resolve things peacefully, it's within the realm of possibility that you will resolve things violently. And everybody knows this, but everybody also has an incentive to try to keep things peaceful for as long as they can and to prevent things from getting to the point where violence is going to be necessary. And so this is the kind of dynamic in which she's growing up. It's a city that has demographic instability because you have now rules that have long been established about settling confrontations violently if you can't negotiate your way out of them. But nobody quite knows how large each side is if the violence is going to come about.
So before we get a little bit more into her life, what about the intellectual life of Alexandria back then? What characterized it? Since we're talking here about a woman intellectual, so
Yeah, so Alexandria in the fourth century AD has, you know, for almost 700 years been the leading center of Greek scientific and mathematical thought, and you know, and medical thought. Um, there is a longstanding rivalry between Alexandria and Athens. Athens, of course, is older, and so Athens has this claim as the center where philosophy was developed, and to a degree where like rhetoric was developed. But in Alexandria, they really have a very strong claim to having invented the most sophisticated mathematics in the ancient world, to have invented the most sophisticated scientific techniques, and you know, to have really advanced mechanical engineering and medical research being done. So there's a rivalry between Athens and Alexandria that you might want to think in like an American context would be like the rivalry between, I don't know, MIT and a school that, is really, really good in teaching philosophy and the humanities. Um, Alexandria is the STEM school, and Athens is the humanities school. And so by the time you get into the fourth century, this is the long-standing way to see things. But it isn't exclusive. Alexandria has a strong tradition of teaching philosophy in a way that embeds mathematics in it. So the Alexandrian idea for a long time had been, well, yes, philosophy is very important, but philosophy is imprecise. You talk about something like Plato's idea of justice, and Plato says, well, there's a basic idea of justice that you can encapsulate in this concept that is a form. Well, Alexandrians say, like, what is that? That's totally abstract. Who knows what a form is? Nobody's ever seen one. We can say, though, that justice can be understood as a number. And if you understand it as a number, then you can explore the elements of that number's use and its characteristics and how it works in a mathematical system. And that allows us better to understand how concepts fit together with each other in a larger world. And so the Alexandrian idea was for a very long time to say, in essence, you want to know about virtue, learn math. You want to learn about how to live your life, learn math, because math is more precise, the relationships are clearer, and they're more defined. And you can actually understand how these concepts work together when you use them through a sort of mathematical symbolism. And so what Alexandria has done leading up to the moment of Hypatia's birth is it's created a very distinctive brand of intellectual life that combines this very long-standing tradition of mathematical and engineering and technical learning with a sort of structure that allows you to apply it to more humanistic pursuits as well. And so this is the kind of world that Hypatia is born into. And she's actually born to the guy who is the leader of this intellectual movement in the 350s.
So now that we, so to speak, set up the stage, who was Hypatia then exactly? What do we know about her origins, how she grew up, the kind of education she received, and so on?
So I am one of the world's biggest like Hypatia fans. I love Hypatia. And I think what we have to understand with Hypatia is there's really sort of two versions of her. There's the version that everybody knows about that's that's most famously celebrated in the movie Agora. She's a martyr. She's somebody who dies for her principles and dies for her philosophical practices.
Mhm.
And that's true. She does. But I think when we allow somebody to become a caricature and we allow them to just be distilled down into this like one moment where we define their entire life, we miss who the person is. And I actually think the person is way more interesting than the martyr. Because what Hypatia represents is, a symbol of rationalism in a moment of extremism. But what Hypatia actually was is a woman who was brilliant and had a vision for how she wanted to change this Alexandrian philosophical environment and this Alexandrian intellectual environment. She understood full and completely that as a woman, this would be a difficult thing to do. And yet, she very actively, very openly, and very compellingly presented a vision of philosophy that upset the entire way that Alexandria thought about philosophy. And then she applied this to trying to regulate the public life in this city that, of course, is prone to violence. And so what she was trying to do is to take her philosophical understanding, make her city better, and do it in a way that was consistent with the philosophical ideals that she embodied and she brought to bear in the way that she lived in the world. And so I think for the 60 years that she's alive, what you see is somebody who understood full well the risks that she was taking. She understood completely the kinds of challenges she would face as a woman trying to do this work. And she did it very eagerly because she thought it was the right thing to do. And she did it understanding completely that there would be personal sacrifices that she would have to make to have the impact on the world that she wanted to. She did it anyway. And so I think that that's a different type of heroism than being a martyr for a cause. What that represents is somebody who is really driven by a set of ideals, and understands completely that there will be personal consequences, but assumes those consequences anyway.
Mhm. Yes, we'll come back to these, to people thinking about Hypatia as a symbol or a myth, even, let's say, than really as a person. But then, how much do we know about her life exactly?
So the sources that we have for Hypatia's life are much less robust than we would like.
Mhm.
We have a set of biographies or a set of biographical treatments of her written by a male pagan philosopher in the 6th century AD. And he's writing at a moment where basically he's in a persecuted community and he loves the idea of martyrs. And so when he's talking about Hypatia, he leans into the martyrdom story, but he had actually studied in Alexandria. And so he had access to substantial materials about what Hypatia had done based on, the time that he had spent in the city. We have a lot of historical narratives that talk about her murder. And some of them do it in a way that contextualizes the murder to explain to an audience why we should pay attention to this. Um, these sources are really important for reconstructing what we know about her life, but we actually do have sources that were written by or about or to her in the period before she died. And those, I think, are much more valuable because that's where you get at who she was as a person. So we have the equivalent of her doctoral dissertation, which is a mathematical text. It's very hard to read. Greek mathematics are, really tricky because, for example, the whole numbers are done on a base 100 system. The decimals are done on a base 60 system. And like Roman numerals, they're all letters. And so you'll be reading a text and there'll be mathematical things in there. And honestly, it's really hard to even know when you're dealing with a whole number and a decimal and what you do with it. And so it is not a very accessible text, but it is hers. She did write it. We do have her work, and people smarter than me who know about how to read this numerical stuff say that her mathematics is pretty elegant. And the contribution that she makes is in taking some very unwieldy material and making it much more much simpler and much more clear than what had been done before. So I think we can say from that she's a very gifted mathematician. But much more interesting for someone like me is we have a set of letters written by one of her students, including 5 letters written to Hypatia herself, and then a few other letters that mention life at her school. And so for these, we have a set of documents that allow us to see what it was like around her when she was alive, without this kind of filter of we're setting up a story to talk about how she dies. And so when we're reconstructing her life, this is the kind of stuff we have to deal with. We're always struggling to distill out the person from the myth, but we do have some things that relate to the person before there even was the myth. And those are invaluable because it allows you to see this person as she actually was, and on the terms that she set while she was alive.
Mhm. And I guess that this is an illustrative example of, I mean, a lot of the work that historians do, right, when it comes to studying the life of historical figures. Many times it's not that we have very well preserved documents written by the person themselves, but we have to resort to secondary, tertiary sources, what other people said about them, wrote about them, what other people thought about them, and so on. That's basically the way we try to bring the pieces together, right?
Yeah, I think that is a perfect summation of it. I think what we're always doing as people is trying to get through the filters that people create to understand who the individual is. So, in a modern context, what you see on somebody's Instagram or what you see on their YouTube channel, that's not who they are. That's who they want you to think they are, maybe. It's the stories that they want you to read about them. It's, you know, it's a curated vision of who that person is. We know that. But in 100 years, I mean, assuming any of this stuff is still around, if you wanted to reconstruct your life or my life using, using the media that's out there about us, you would have a vision of us, but it would be a vision that is curated. And maybe it's very well curated and maybe it's very sloppy, but it's a vision that doesn't relate to who we are so much as who we want to be seen to be. And so historians are always dealing with this problem as well. It just, we have a lot less when we're dealing with somebody from the 4th century AD than when we're going through somebody's Instagram posts now. But this is always the challenge. And so when you have something that is transparently about creating a story that symbolizes somebody, in some ways it makes it easier because you know this person, you know what they're trying to do in telling the story this way. And so you're able to go through, find the details that are legitimate details that this person has then transformed into an element of a story in the way they want to tell. And you can take these details out and you can start building a picture from the details that are clearly facts that the person telling the story is using to support their larger argument. Those facts are still facts. And when you assemble enough of them, you have a set of ideas that are grounded in something like reality you can use to talk about who the person was and what they're doing. And you know, and it's the work of a historian, but it's also the work of everybody. You know, we are very well trained now in doing this in a 21st century environment. It's just, we just have a lot less when we're working with the 4th century.
Right. And do we know how exactly Hypatia got interested in philosophy, how she got into philosophy, and then how she eventually rose to prominence as a philosopher?
Yeah, it's a really fascinating story because in antiquity, especially in, you know, the 4th and 5th centuries, there's a real tendency among intellectuals to try to keep the intellectual traditions in the family. So a lot of intellectuals, when they have children, if they have a male child, they want to train them in the ideas and the traditions of the intellectual pursuits that the father specializes in. If they have a female child, they like to train their daughter in these pursuits as well, for a couple reasons. I mean, the first is, it's great if you own a school to marry your daughter to like your top student. And we see a number of examples of this. The reason that they like to do this is, of course, it keeps the school in the family. And so, you know, so you have your intellectual descendant, and in antiquity, if you studied under somebody, you were called the son or daughter of the person that you studied under. And so you have your intellectual son marrying your biological daughter. That's great. But another thing that happens frequently is, you know, the daughters get married in their teens and the sons can get married in their 30s or 40s. So it is very common for a husband in these relationships to be even a generation older than his wife, and he very frequently will die before his wife. Sometimes he'll die before his wife and before his child is even old enough to go to school. And so it's a tradition in these intellectual families to train their daughters in rhetoric and philosophy and mathematics so that the daughters are capable of maintaining control and supervising the education of the children. So you have a lot of examples of women from intellectual families getting the equivalent of, you know, almost a graduate degree. You know, they go through a very significant course of study because it's their patrimony in a sense. And they're going to be responsible for making sure that the next generation of intellectuals in this family are trained appropriately and have, you know, the right teachers and the right background and the right skills to succeed in this intellectual endeavor. And so this is how Hypatia is brought up. You know, she's the daughter of the top mathematician and philosopher in the city of Alexandria, and
Mhm.
it's expected that she's going to have that training. And I'm sure that what her father is anticipating is she'll be trained in his school and in his methods, and and she'll be perfectly sufficient in this, and that will be great. And she'll marry somebody who will then probably lead the school, and they'll have children, and she'll train the children, and and that will be her role. And what happens instead is Hypatia is spectacular. She comes into the classroom and she's not going to be, it becomes very clear, she's not going to be the wife of the successor. She's going to be the successor because she is far better than anybody else, including her father. And so what Hypatia begins doing is, she's learning the mathematics in the Alexandrian way, this idea that mathematics correlates to philosophical truth, and the highest philosophical truth is actually understood through mathematics. And she starts reading the works of philosophers like Plotinus and Porphyry, and she realizes that's not true. She doesn't accept that. She doesn't believe that mathematics is a higher level way to understand philosophy. Actually, she thinks it's the reverse. And so she wants to follow Plato in this idea that, yeah, math is helpful because it gives you very fixed ways to work with concepts, but the forms are actually superior to numbers. Numbers are precise but inaccurate, and they don't give you a full picture of the larger philosophical concepts. And Hypatia reads this and she says, you know what, this is right. And she's an exceptional mathematician, but she ultimately goes to her father and convinces him, you know what, you've been doing this wrong. What you really need to understand is concepts are more important than numbers. And concepts are where the higher level understanding of the universe lives, not in numbers, but in these ideas. And so we need to change the way we teach. And her father, who is a member of the museum in Alexandria, the top intellectual in the city, he not only agrees to this, he retires and lets her take over the school while he's still alive. Because he basically says, yeah, she's better than me. She knows more than me. She has a better vision for what this philosophy should do. And she's a better teacher than me and a better scholar than me. So why would I want to stand in her way? Like, let's let philosophy become better than I'm able to make it. And so he steps down and lets her take over the school, probably when she's in her 30s.
Mhm. And back then, what was basically the social status of women? I mean, did people accept that a woman herself would be the head of a philosophy school or not?
So it was possible, but it wasn't easy.
Mhm.
So the understanding is that women can lead intellectual institutions,
Mm.
but they're always going to be facing, people making jokes at their expense, people
Yeah.
discounting their expertise, people making fun of the fact that they wear, when a philosopher in antiquity would go out in public, they would wear a specific robe called a
Mhm.
tribon. It's kind of like when somebody gets their doctoral degree and they get these robes from the university that are
Yeah.
really like grandiose and floppy hats and all of this kind of stuff. Um, yeah, I mean, there was the same thing in antiquity, but you were expected actually to wear that stuff around the city, especially in, any kind of ceremonial occasion. And so she's wearing the philosopher's cloak, and people joke, well, it's a woman wearing the philosopher's cloak. Like, isn't that funny? And in Greek, you actually can do something with the language where you talk about the act of wearing a tribon, and it can have a masculine or feminine ending. And it always has a masculine ending, except when they talk about Hypatia. And so there are authors that make a joke about like the feminine ending of wearing a tribone and how funny it is that, she's doing that. So her whole life, she's dealing with this this understanding that, yeah, it's possible for her to run a school, but also this kind of like people giggling and joking and laughing about her, and also more malicious things. like people saying, well, she is a woman leading a philosophical school, and all of the students are men, and a lot of philosophical teaching is done in public, but some of it is done in private, especially the graduate level work, where it's just the teacher and the graduate students. And so that's maybe 10, 15 people at most. And so you have this environment where you have Hypatia and then 15 young men. And so there are stories that start circulating about, well, this is really like a sex cult or something. And Hypatia has to diffuse those stories too. So it is possible for a woman to lead a school. There are other women who led schools, but it's much harder for a woman to do that work than for a man to do the same thing. And I think that's what we have to acknowledge is Roman society is the sort of place that makes it easier for men to do a lot of things, but it doesn't wholly preclude women from doing them. But if a woman chooses to do it, something like teach philosophy, she chooses it understanding full well that it is going to be much harder for her to do this work than for a man to do it. And she's going to assume a lot of public scrutiny that a man wouldn't get. And she's going to have to deal with a lot of stuff that, a regular person probably doesn't want to deal with. And so while women can do this work, a lot of them say, you know what? Yeah, I don't really want to run my own school because I don't want to have this kind of scrutiny, and I don't want to have this kind of rumor mongering and public, hostility. So a lot of women in antiquity who teach philosophy actually do it as a kind of subordinate teacher in a school that is run by a man. That's much more common than a woman running her own school. Mainly, I think, because, well, why do you want the extra hassles and scrutiny and trouble of running your own school when you can more or less do the same thing and you don't have to deal with any of that? And so what Hypatia is choosing to do by taking over for her father is, I think, a very conscious choice to assume a lot of burdens that she didn't need to assume. I mean, she could have very happily continued teaching under her father and not dealt with any of this stuff.
Right. So, I mean, this is very interesting, and I guess that we'll probably come back to this point when later on we talk about her legacy. Because, I mean, in that particular case, perhaps even if there weren't really actual institutional and legal, I guess, barriers to her leading a philosophical school, there were certainly some social and cultural barriers that she had to deal with. I guess that we can even call it discrimination in a sense, right?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges that I had, and I still think I have in conceptualizing the career of Hypatia, is um, importing a kind of modern idea of what should be fair on an ancient context where I don't think she thought that way. Like I don't think she thought, well, it's unfair that I have to do these things.
Mm.
I think instead she thought, well, this is my burden. This is how
Okay.
it is. And if I need to do this work, well, that's my path. And I choose this path. And so there wasn't any point in her saying something like, this is unequal treatment, or this is
Mm.
discrimination against me. It wouldn't have made any difference to the people listening. And she couldn't have changed that. And I think she understood that. And so it's not that she's leading a good, 19th century struggle for women's suffrage or something. She doesn't expect that she's going to change these conditions. Every woman is going to face these conditions if they want to do what
Mhm.
she's doing. She doesn't get into this to change those conditions. She gets into teaching philosophy because that's her mission. And if it
Mhm.
means she has to endure things that her male colleagues don't, well, then she has to endure things that her male colleagues don't. She's not in this to make things more fair for women. She doesn't, I think, imagine that that's possible,
Mhm.
but it's certainly not what she is aiming to do, even if she thought it could be possible. She is fully accepting the fact that for her entire life, to perform the mission that she believes she has to perform, she is going to have to deal with much harsher conditions than she would face if she was a man. And so I think that that's one of the things that we struggle with, because we assume that in a modern context, if you take an action like that, it might get better. You know, if you are a woman philosopher and you go into an environment that is hostile to female philosophers, we imagine that the example of that woman philosopher might make that environment less hostile, because she will, by her example, change perceptions. That is not, I think, what Hypatia is doing. I don't think she imagines for a moment that she's going to change perceptions or make things easier for the next female philosopher in the future. I think she understands that the conditions are going to remain bad for her entire life, and she does it anyway. And there's a particular kind of a set of assumptions there that I don't think many people in the modern world really share.
So, what were her main intellectual contributions? What was she known for and is known for?
So I think one of the biggest things that Hypatia does, of course, is flipping Alexandria from this strange way of thinking about philosophy to this more conventional way of thinking about philosophy as something guided by concepts, larger concepts and larger constructions of how the world should work. I think we can't undersell that, right? This is changing the entire intellectual identity of a city, and changing its way of functioning and teaching, and doing it very quickly, and doing it as someone who is, of course, something of an outsider, because there aren't many women who try to even do this, and there are very, very few who actually succeed in doing this. But then I think the other contribution that she makes is she understands how to take this tradition of philosophical thought that she's inherited from thinkers like Plotinus and Porphyry, and make it something that is non-denominational in a religious context. What basically this philosophy said is there is a higher power, a sort of unified divine entity, and all of the world flows out of this higher power. But it is possible, if you really distill down the essence of truth and you focus your intellectual energies, it is possible for you as a human to ascend from this sort of messy world of matter to this higher sort of spiritual plane and interact directly with the sort of pure, unfiltered wisdom that comes from this supreme entity. What Hypatia realizes is this particular structure doesn't define who that supreme entity is. It doesn't say this is a pagan supreme entity and Christians are wrong. What Hypatia basically says is, you know what, this is a way of thinking about truth and knowledge. And I'm not going to put a label on it. If you are a Christian and you believe that that supreme entity is a Christian God, well, okay. That great. You do you, I do me. As long as we believe in this philosophical system and this contemplative approach, you don't need to put a label on what that divinity is to benefit from that particular approach. You as a person can reach a higher spiritual plane. And, if you are a Christian and you come from a Christian tradition, this is a contemplative activity. And so you can still go to church, right? I'm not requiring you to do pagan sacrifices to reach this supreme God. And if you're a pagan, I'm not requiring you to do pagan sacrifices to reach this supreme God either. You can be in the same room with this Christian, thinking these same ideas, interacting with these same concepts, and having the same benefits that come from being a philosopher, whether you're pagan or Christian. And no one was doing this in the Roman world at the later part of the 4th century. What Hypatia realized is she lives in a Christian majority city. She lives in a city where pagans and Christians disagree about a lot of things, sometimes violently. And yet there is a way philosophically to make everybody better in a way that doesn't require you to be pagan or Christian. There is instead a common path that everybody can follow that is open to both pagans and Christians, but is philosophical and is firmly grounded in 700 years of thinking by people like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. And so the contribution that Hypatia makes is to create a way for philosophy to function in a Christian majority environment, and to function well and meaningfully for both Christians and pagans without requiring them to compromise their religious beliefs or to do things that might run afoul of the religious practices of their communities.
So she was a philosopher, but she also participated in the politics of Alexandria, right? And if so, in what ways did she do it? And also, how did that tie to her ideas about public service?
Yeah, I think that this is a key part of what it meant to be a philosopher in antiquity, this idea of public service. One of the key obligations that people from the philosophical tradition that Hypatia belonged to believe they assumed was this responsibility to instruct everybody. This goes back to Socrates, right? This responsibility to instruct everybody to the degree that a person is capable of understanding the political and ethical concepts that made society better. And so it was the obligation of a practicing philosopher to speak to everyone in their city. And if they are intelligent and well-read and interested, you can train them in highest level philosophy so that they can ascend to this intellectual level and interact with this supreme divinity. That's great, but that's not everybody. That's actually not most people. Instead, your obligation is to figure out, okay, I'm talking to this person. Their intellectual level is here. How do I make them better? How do I make them more philosophical? They're never going to understand the supreme divinity. They're not capable of doing that. But maybe they are capable of understanding justice in a more rudimentary way. Well, then my job is to instruct them in how to behave more justly towards their fellow citizens. And so Hypatia, it was her obligation as a philosopher to interact politically with the people around her and to train them to behave better in a way that was consistent with philosophical practice, but also was calibrated so that it was consistent with their ability to implement those teachings. And so Hypatia very much believed that in the city of Alexandria, she needed to be available to anybody who wanted to receive her guidance. So that meant that she kept her house more or less open to anybody who wanted to come in and get help. And sometimes that meant she would help them in a lawsuit. Sometimes that meant they were new to the city and she would help them find an apartment or a job. And sometimes that meant she would talk to them about God. But she made sure that she was available to everybody to help them in whatever way was most appropriate to their needs, so that she could make her city more broadly a better, more philosophical place. And she would do this individually. She would also do this collectively. She would give speeches. She would meet with governors. She would interact with the city council. She saw it as her obligation to do political activities in every context to make philosophy felt in the public life of her city.
And so, what events then led to her death? What happened exactly?
Yeah, so this is one of those particularly Alexandrian tragedies. When we talked earlier about what is the dynamic like in this city, we talked about how this is a very dense city. There are a lot of people, and these conflicts between these people frequently became violent. And so what happened in the year 412 was you had the death of the leader of the Christian community in the city of Alexandria, a man named Theophilus. And Theophilus had presided over a really significant outbreak of violence in the early 390s. But for the next generation, for the next 20 years, he and Hypatia and people like Hypatia had created a kind of common understanding that this level of violence was a real problem, and they wanted to tone it down. And so they had built a kind of way for the leading members of the Christian community and people like Hypatia and the leading sort of civic officials to coexist, and to let their differences be resolved through communication and conversation rather than violence. But in 412, Theophilus died, and there was a contested election about who should succeed him as the Bishop of Alexandria. That, because it's Alexandria, resulted in violence. And the person who came out on top in the violence was Theophilus's nephew, Cyril. The problem that Cyril had is the violence had been significant enough that there were communities in Alexandria that actually weren't Christian that had weighed in on this, including the city's very large Jewish community. So Alexandria is maybe 10 to 20% Jewish, where the numbers vary. They're never a majority. They know they're never going to be a majority, but they're a significant enough community that you do have to pay attention to them if you're an official in Alexandria. And so Cyril starts taking action against Christian communities that opposed him, administrators that opposed him, and Jewish people who opposed him. And eventually the governor of Alexandria has to step in and try to calm things down. And what he decides to do is build a coalition of people who are not supporters of Cyril to try to rein the bishop in. And he more or less elects Hypatia to build this coalition. So Hypatia does what she's supposed to do. She's a philosopher. She's been called by a leader in her city to step in and try to make the city calmer and more philosophical. And she has succeeded in doing this in the past. So she starts working with the governor to try to create political conditions in the city that are calmer and marginalize Cyril at the same time. Cyril knows that he would be hard pressed to actually go after the governor. And so he starts making noises about if this is Hypatia's fault, she's the reason that we aren't getting along. There is a riot in which some of Cyril's supporters attack the governor. They throw a rock at his head. The person who did this is arrested and executed. And at this point, the rhetoric against Hypatia becomes more aggressive. So we see in our sources some very clear indications that people around Cyril were saying things like Hypatia's a witch, she's a magician, she is using magic to make the governor not like Cyril. And, and for this reason, something needs to be done. Now, we don't know that Cyril himself said this, but there are supporters of Cyril who decide that this gives them grounds to attack Hypatia. And so this is kind of the lead up to her murder. There is this growing tension in Alexandria. It is this sort of periodic move from conversation to violence that happens every generation or so in Alexandria. And this is how she gets caught up in it.
And so what was then the aftermath of her death? How did people respond to it?
So the murder of Hypatia happens in Lent. It doesn't seem that Cyril spoke directly to this. It doesn't seem that Cyril said, go kill Hypatia.
Yeah.
It doesn't even seem that Cyril endorsed it after the fact. But what you have are you have a situation where, because Hypatia is so publicly available, it's actually easy to grab her. What happens frequently in the Roman world is mobs get angry at elites. And most frequently what happens is the elites live in these houses that are very well fortified. They have a big gate. If you've been to the Mediterranean, you've been to the city of Rome even, like the houses have very strong out-facing walls, very big doors, very strong gates. There's a reason for that, right? Mobs might come to try to get you. And most of the time what happens is they come, the gate is there, you have bodyguards, they yell, they scream. Maybe if they're really mad, they might throw something to try to burn your house down, but most of the time you're not there at that point. And, and it's a ritual almost, where if you are expressing your discontent about the behavior of a leading person in a Roman city, most of the time it actually doesn't become violent. They are intending to scare you. You know what's going on, and you moderate your behavior if it bothers you. And a lot of the time, everybody knows that this is the game. But Hypatia doesn't live that way. She doesn't live behind walls with shut doors and closed gates. When she travels in the city, she doesn't do it with bodyguards and, carried in a litter and protected. She walks like a normal person. She behaves like a normal person. Her door is open. And so if you're angry at Hypatia, you might have expected that you left that day to go and yell outside of her door to intimidate her. But suddenly you find her in the street and she's not protected and there's nobody preventing you from doing anything. The mob loses control and it seizes Hypatia and it kills her. And it kills her very brutally. They take her to a public square. They take broken roof tiles and they tear her body apart. And then they burn her body in public as a way to purify the city from the wickedness that's supposedly attached to her. I don't think Cyril knew this was going to happen. I don't think Cyril was particularly thrilled that it did happen. And the outcry that you see in sources suggests that there is almost nobody in the entire Roman Empire, Christian or pagan, who thinks this was justified. There's an imperial commission that's sent to investigate this. Cyril escapes punishment for instigating this riot by basically bribing the commissioners so that he doesn't get found, responsible. One of the organizations that Cyril and the Alexandrian Church had used as a kind of way to mobilize supporters and pressure opponents, this is disbanded by imperial officials despite Cyril's bribes. And all of our sources written in the immediate aftermath of Hypatia's death talk about this like it is an extremely serious breach in the social fabric of the Roman Empire. One of these sources that I think is one of the most interesting has it's at the end of his history, and he has an entire narrative where he's talking about how Roman society is coming apart. And he gives a set of examples from the 410s. The first one is a set of violent confrontations in Constantinople that are diffused more or less because he thinks the bishop did a good job. The next one is the sack of Rome by Alaric in 410. The event that, like, beyond everything else in our imagination, symbolizes the decline of Roman power and Roman virtue and Roman integrity in the 5th century. For him, the murder of Hypatia is an even more powerful symbol of the decline of the Roman Empire than the sack of Rome. The sack of Rome is, the lead up to what he sees as indicative of Roman society is coming apart. And it's the murder of Hypatia. Because for him, she is a person who is just and true and behaving in a fashion that you cannot attack as partisan. What she's trying to do is make her society better in the purest way imaginable, not for material benefit, not because she can get an office out of it, not because she can seize imperial power. She's trying to make her city better and her world better because she believes it is her job to make her city and her world better. And she dies for it. And so for Socrates Scholasticus and a lot of people like him, this is a symbol of a sort of rip in the fabric of the Roman world that is incomprehensible. This is a person who is acting with pure and true motives, who's killed because of those actions. And he doesn't see how society comes back from that.
And so in the centuries following her death, looking at, I don't know, other intellectuals and even artists, the way they have portrayed their reacted to her. I mean, first of all, how common is it across the history of philosophy for other philosophers to actually get in touch with her work or even become aware of her?
Nobody reads her work now. That commentary is, nobody really works on that material. There's maybe 10 people in the world who work on that material, and the people who work on it don't read her commentary. So I think in terms of her actual work, her published work, it's basically forgotten. in terms of the impact of her actions, that is not forgotten at all. I think if you, at one point I looked at how many philosophers from antiquity, who are the most common philosophers in antiquity if you do Google searches for their mentions. And it's the big three: Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Hypatia, number 4. And so what is it that actually matters about Hypatia? It's actually, I think, the deeds. It's what she did. And this is something that I think a lot of philosophers until very recently downplayed. Philosophy is about thought and it's about concepts, but it's about actions also. And so in antiquity, as the French philosopher Pierre Hadot says, actually philosophy is about what you do. It's a way of life. And what I think you get from Hypatia is not so much there's this particular doctrine that Hypatia pioneered, or this particular way of solving a philosophical problem that Hypatia discovered. What you have is somebody who in a most pure way embodies a way of life, a philosophical way of life, in a fashion that was consistent across her entire life and also led to her death. And so I think when philosophers consider the influence of a way of life, this too is why Socrates matters to us. There's no writings from Socrates.
Right.
But we remember Socrates because what Socrates did is embodied a way of life in a fashion that was particularly memorable and true and uncompromising. That's what Hypatia did as well. It's a different moment than Socrates. She's a different person than Socrates, but her legacy is as important, or is important like Socrates, because like Socrates, she embodied a way of life that philosophers believe to be admirable, and a way of life that philosophers believe should be emulated if one actually lives according to the philosophical principles that one expounds.
So, could we say that she has been influential as a philosopher or not?
Again, I think a lot of philosophers would say she has no influence on modern philosophy. I would say actually the opposite. I think she has tremendous influence as a philosopher in the way that most people think about philosophy. I think most of us agree that philosophy is something that should not be just an abstract thing about concepts that have no bearing on the world around us. Who cares about that? It's not why most of us are interested in philosophy. It's not why lots and lots and lots of people read Stoicism now. Nobody's reading Stoicism because they want to think more deeply about, I don't know, the end of the end of the universe or something. They're thinking about Stoicism because what it does is it offers a very clear way to function practically in the world. It offers practical ethics and a way for us to come up with a way of life that makes our ability to function in this environment that we inhabit better. That's what philosophy ultimately does for most people who are interested in philosophy. That's what Hypatia does. That's where she contributes to philosophy, is she gives us in its almost purest form somebody who is devoted to this idea that there is an ethical way to behave that's guided by higher principles that can be organized systematically, and it is possible to live your life consistently with that. And it is possible to do it in a fashion that is so uncompromising that you even give your life to the principles that your manner of behaving embodies. That's where I think her legacy is most strong. And that's why we still talk about her. Because for most people, philosophy isn't about like a particular doctrine of the soul or a particular like way of approaching, I don't know, atomic particles or something. Philosophy is about how do you live better in the world around you. That's what she was. That's what she did, and that's what her example allows us to see.
But then, when it comes to the history of philosophy itself and how she might or might not have influenced other philosophers and the way philosophy developed in the West, particularly, I'm asking you this because many times we hear about Hypatia and other historical female philosophers, when there's, for example, some feminist philosophers talking about them, and even mentioning also some other contemporary female philosophers, that because they are women, they say that's one of the main reasons why they haven't played really a prominent role in the history of philosophy, or been very intellectually influential or something like that. What do you think about that? Do you think that that might have played a role there, the fact that she was a woman compared to, for example, prominent figures like Aristotle, Plato, and others after them?
I think that the biggest reason we don't have philosophical works by Hypatia actually is because of her murder. Because what her murder does is it destroys this philosophical tradition in Alexandria that she was building.
Mhm.
Um, the rivalry between Athens and Alexandria was very real during Hypatia's life. But in Athens, there was a tradition that was exclusively pagan and actually involved pagan sacrifices as part of your philosophical practice. So for Hypatia, the idea of unifying with this spiritual realm was
Mhm.
contemplative. You would focus your life on philosophical principles. You would eventually come to a point where your mind was so undisturbed that it could ascend to this level where you interacted with the divine. And that was something that both Christians and pagans could do in the same room. In Athens, the tradition was, well, okay, yeah, I mean, in theory, you can do that, but you can actually, you can't do it that often, and it's really hard to do. And so you can move to this level by doing certain rituals that help you move to this level. And those rituals are, of course, pagan rituals, because these philosophers are pagan. When Hypatia is killed, her version of that philosophy is killed with her. And so the tradition that she embodies, it gets snuffed. And
Mhm.
so the texts that were consistent with that tradition, once, the Athenian tradition develops out of the ideas of a teacher named Iamblichus in the 4th century. Plotinus and Porphyry were texts that both Iamblichus and Hypatia read. Hypatia didn't interact with Iamblichus at all. And so the Athenian tradition uses Plotinus and Porphyry just as Hypatia would have. But Hypatia's interaction with them is not something that they are interested in. So this Athenian tradition then becomes the dominant force in philosophy in the 5th century because Hypatia has been killed. And the reason that we don't talk about Hypatia is because that Athenian tradition is the tradition ultimately that moves into Arab philosophy, and it moves into Byzantine philosophy.
Mm.
And so when
Okay.
Byzantine philosophers are interacting with philosophy from the 4th and 5th centuries, they're interacting with the Athenian philosophy, not the Hypatian philosophy. And so it is an accident, in a sense, of history, that a conflict between one set of approaches to philosophy based in Athens and another set based in Alexandria didn't happen because Hypatia was killed. And once she's killed, the school ends. And so her intellectual legacy is snuffed out because of the murder. So the texts and the system, all of this stuff is destroyed because there is no one to pick it up. So it doesn't make it out of antiquity and into Byzantium. And then this Byzantine tradition is what Ficino and the Florentines and ultimately, our entire structure of Western philosophy, that's where it comes from. And so it is really, in a weird way, her murder leaves this legacy of practical philosophy that is unmatched by anybody from that Athenian tradition. But it destroys the textual tradition and
Mm.
the systematic sort of evolution of her ideas in a fashion that is unrecoverable. So I think that there is it's a really unfortunate situation, because it is possible that that Athenian tradition would have been defeated by a Hypatian Alexandrian tradition. And our philosophical tradition would actually now not be Iamblichus and all of the things that we see coming out of 5th and 6th century Athens. It would instead be Hypatia and a bunch of things that would then come out of the descendants from her line in Alexandria. And that's what was destroyed in 415.
So at least in this particular case of Hypatia, you don't think there's good enough evidence to suppose that one of the reasons she's been mostly ignored in the more, let's say, textual, actual philosophical tradition in the West is much more accidental than because of her being a woman, right?
I think so.
Mhm.
I think it is certainly possible that if
Mhm.
in the 17th century we had texts by Hypatia, someone
Yeah.
would have made the decision to read other things instead because she was a woman.
Yeah.
And there's a really interesting example of a female mathematician named Pendrosian,
Yeah.
who we know about. She ran her own school, and she, because of Hypatia's sort of work in destroying this mathematical consensus, her work and the work of the people engaging with her is not very well preserved either. But it's
Mhm.
interesting that the people who edited the text that mentions Pendrosian's work actually just, there was a feminine article that, like, she's marked as E. Pandrosian, and the person editing the text said, well, that must be an error because it says she's a woman. So they changed the text to say whole Pandrosian to say she's a man. And people went back and said, wait a second. No, I mean, she's a woman. It's clear she's a woman, So there are definitely possibilities that had Hypatia's work survived into the 17th or 18th century, somebody would have said exactly this, right? Well, maybe she's not a woman, or this work is not as good because she's a woman. Nobody even had the chance. I think that's the thing, right? Like,
Okay.
we can correct for that. We can go back and say, here is a voice that is underrepresented, but here's the voice. And like, let's rebuild the tradition and say that this voice has been underrepresented. But her
Mhm.
voice was destroyed. It never even got to the modern period. And I think that's the great tragedy here.
Mhm.
We don't even have the opportunity to go back and do that work
Yeah.
because of the destruction done in the 5th century.
So I have one final question then. In modern times, in contemporary times, how do people look at Hypatia? Because earlier you mentioned people looking at her mostly as a symbol and not so much as the person she effectively was. So, but as a symbol of what exactly? What does Hypatia symbolize for modern people?
Yeah, this is one of the most interesting things about reading about Hypatia. I mean, for the book, I went back and I looked at all of these moments where you see her from the 15th century to now. And because she is understood as a symbol of a pure and total commitment to rationality and intellectual pursuit,
Mhm.
people put whatever they believe the most purest form of intellectual pursuit and commitment should look like. So at various moments you have her as a symbol of absolute commitment to STEM, right? So Agora has her as like a Copernican, which is totally made up. I mean, it's like ridiculous. um, Hypatia was a lifelong virgin, but you actually have somebody who writes a thing about Hypatia that commits her to a lifestyle of like hedonism and like lots and lots and lots of sexual partners, which Hypatia would have looked at and said, like, she would have been horrified that anybody would think that's her legacy. um, but it becomes something where whatever ideas you particularly think are the purest, you can make Hypatia a symbol of those ideas. And you can talk about irrationality and intolerance destroying those ideas that you think ought to be preserved and supported. And Hypatia becomes a sort of stand-in for that. Um, and I think that's something we have to be very aware of anytime Hypatia is introduced in a conversation. She is a symbol, and it's a symbol that is extremely resonant because the purity is absolute. This is somebody who truly lived according to a set of principles that she understood very deeply. She thought very hard about how those principles should guide her behavior. She behaved completely in accordance with, the system that she developed, and she died because of it. And there's something really admirable about a story like that, but there's also something very malleable about a story like that. And you can take that and take whatever principles you want and use her as a metaphor to illustrate complete commitment to whatever principles you think are most important. And it's a very dangerous thing, because in a lot of those cases, Hypatia just would not have agreed with you. The Hypatia that you create was not a Hypatia that ever existed. And I think there is an obligation that we have to the people in the past to be true to their memory. If we can understand what somebody was about, we can't understand all of what somebody was about. We can understand all of what their concerns and ideas were. But if we can understand to some degree what they were like and what was important to them, we should try to be true to those ideals. And putting Hypatia in a situation that she would not be at all comfortable with is, I think, doing some measure of injustice to an actual person who actually did live, actually did feel things, and have emotions and have reactions and feel tension and feel pressure, and made choices. We should be true to that, because we would want someone to do that for us too.
Well, I would imagine that Hypatia would not be alone when it comes to historical figures that are commonly, or whose ideas are commonly misrepresented.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, great. So the book is again Hypatia, The Life and Legend of an Ancient Philosopher. And of course, I'm leaving a link to it in the description of the interview, and also links to our two previous interviews. And Dr. Watts, just before we go, would you like to tell people again where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Sure. I have a YouTube channel that's called Eternal Decline of Rome, and we post on there all sorts of things about Rome. And it is also the place where as I say it, it's where I put my outtakes. So when I'm doing research and I find something that's interesting that is never going to make a book, I'll do little videos on those. So if you're interested in Roman stuff, big or small, that's a good place to go.
Great. So, Dr. Watts, thank you again so much for taking the time to come on the show. And as I said at the beginning, it's always fun and a real pleasure to talk to you.
Absolutely. Well, I love it, and I look forward to talking again soon.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sundo, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Kossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stantanti, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Allman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles de Moray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, B.R. Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugnik, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Giancarlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.